University of Michigan cultural psychologist Joseph Gahn visited the University of Montana this week to discuss the issue of historical trauma. Dr. Gahn attended the Military Academy at West Point, earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from Harvard, and earned a master's and doctorate in clinical and community psychology from the University of Illinois. In tonight's feature interview with reporter Edward O'Brien, Gahn, an enrolled member of Montana's Gros Ventre tribe, discusses how the historical trauma concept applies to Native Americans. First, Gahn explains his interest in cultural psychology.
Cultural psychology is another identity I embrace because I'm very interested in the ways in which culture and mind co-create one another. That is, that our psychologies are embedded and emergent from cultural practices and processes that we inherit as socialized beings into families and communities. And so I'm always quite attuned to the ways in which one's cultural practices or cultural surround shapes one's experience, one's habits of thinking, one's emotional experience and expression, etc.
And to drill down a little further, specifically Native culture, correct?
I am interested particularly in American Indian mental health kinds of concerns, particularly at the ethno-psychological foundations for American Indian mental health. That is, I'm interested in looking back to see the ways in which identity, self, emotion, and its expression may have differed quite radically than what we're accustomed to in modern, especially suburban, affluent America, and trying to trace and track those kinds of differences for what they might mean for rendering psychological assistance to Native people today.
And then I guess here's a good place to enter historical trauma without getting too specific. Generally, what does historical trauma mean?
Historical trauma is an elaboration of what we think of as trauma more generally, psychological trauma, but moves it into the realm of collective shared experience that has been passed intergenerationally over time from events, particularly cataclysmic events in the context of colonization for American Indians, that may have disrupted people's well-being for generations. And so it's a way of talking about social ills today in particular communities that can be traced back to all sorts of difficult, trying, overwhelming historical experiences like military engagements with the U.S. Army, reservation captivity, resource theft, etc.
How does something that happened all those years ago manifest itself today? What are the symptoms, I guess?
Well, historical trauma today is recognized in some ways as an extension of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is a recognized psychiatric disorder that is a way of talking about people's reactions and maladaptive reactions in particular to traumatic experiences. It's comprised of symptoms related to re-experiencing horrific events, trying to avoid things that remind one of those horrific events, and being overly hypervigilant and aroused in the face of those kinds of memories or signifiers. Historical trauma suggests that these sorts of reactions can be heightened or passed down through generations from that time before in mechanisms that are not quite clear yet. So I'm actually not a big fan of historical trauma myself. I grapple with it because it is very prevalent as a way of talking about social ills in Indian country today. And so I take it seriously and want to think critically about it.
And Dr. Gunn, what would you say to somebody who's listening who says this sounds like excuse making for generations of families who have made bad decisions or gotten wrapped up in substance abuse?
I'd say two things. The first is that it's very clear that there is a historical origin to the epidemic of social ills that afflict Indian country, and you can trace those back to various aspects of the colonial encounter. So alcohol, widespread alcohol abuse, or other kinds of family and social disruption are obviously evident in the moment of the various kinds of injustices I talked about. And then the ways those get passed down, of course, are not so unintuitive. When kids are raised by alcoholic parents who aren't able to really attend to them or meet their needs properly, they're at higher risk for alcoholism themselves. And so you can see how things could get passed down in that way that had an origin some time ago. Now, one problem I have with only focusing on those aspects is it ignores a great deal of resilience that can also be found in Indian country, in which lots of Native people don't have those particular kinds of problems. In fact, the very best epidemiological evidence of psychiatric disturbance in reservation communities suggests that American Indians are actually no more likely than regular adult Americans to have suffered from a diagnosable mental disorder at some point in their lives. So there's lots of tales of resilience that we're not hearing about while instead we're hearing a great deal about disorder, distress, and breakdowns of various kinds.
And that was my next question. How do you explain success stories like yourself and countless other people who have gone on to be very successful, happy, normal people?
Well, that's the question. And, so research dollars haven't flowed so much to those kinds of questions in Indian country. And it's in part because what the research does show is when Indians do have some of these disorders, they can be more severe or more extreme, more disruptive, disabling. And so there's clearly all of us who are Native have family members who have struggled with these things. And so there's a great impetus to want to do something helpful for those folks. But in a world of scarce resource allocation, we're left without having resources to study how resilience operates and how people can grow up in the same environments with some of the same obstacles and challenges and yet emerge and flourish despite that. And that's a direction we need to move and focus our thinking in Indian country, not only on things that have gone wrong and how to repair those, but also how to harness what goes right and how to invest in the flourishing of our future generations as well.
And those resources that you mentioned getting scarcer all the time these days, I'm assuming, yeah?
Well, yes, they are, although there's still a great deal of opportunity for behavioral scientists and health researchers to be able to access resources to study these kinds of things if they would choose. So it's not only that resources are drying up, it's also what people tend to think is important and how they choose to frame the kinds of issues that are important to them. And I think that what I'm calling for in some ways is a bit of a reframe or a refocusing of attention or energy towards some of these additional questions. It's not that the other questions are not important as well, but there needs to be a balance. And I think that balance can be reached by more people being willing to reframe in terms of looking at positive, resilient success stories and trying to figure out what are the psychological processes that undergird those, alongside some of the darker tales.
Using along the way culturally appropriate services, I read.
Culturally appropriate services, that's a term that is widely accepted and promoted within mental health circles and human services settings. It's not always exactly clear what that means, so you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that I can find myself being critical of that term as well because it is so widely circulated without a great deal of unpacking. But it's certainly the case that there are large numbers of Native people who are culturally oriented in ways that differ from the surrounding working class, middle class communities who are non-Native, and because of those cultural orientations are going to respond to interventions for help or even for studies to investigate important processes like positive functioning differently than surrounding communities would. And it's that difference that requires a tailoring, if not a complete reconfiguring of how one should go about those things to make sure that one is able to access and understand what one is observing.
Historical trauma unique to Native Americans or no, if you buy into the theory?
Historical trauma, as applied to American Indians, has been popularized in the past 15 years or so. But in some ways, it emerges from a clinical literature concerning Holocaust survivors and their offspring. So historical trauma has been used to talk about Japanese American descendants from incarceration during World War II. It's been applied quite widely, actually, to different communities where there have been disruptions, whether colonial or other kinds. But I think in this country, it's heavily associated with American Indians as well as Holocaust survivors.
African Americans, too, I would think.
Absolutely true, although, it's not a discourse that I've heard as frequently when I've read and encountered stuff about African American experience, and I'm not entirely sure why that would be. It's interesting sociological aspect right there for why there might be different emphases that different communities tend to place on their historical experiences and how they choose to frame those.
Is this something recognized by the American Psychological Association?
No, it's not. In fact, in some ways it's meant, as I said, to elaborate or extend post-traumatic stress disorder, which is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association. The American Psychiatric Association grapples with disorders of trauma that don't fit neatly into the prototype for PTSD, which is combat experience or rape or a catastrophe of some kind that leads then people to have dysfunctional symptoms as a result. But critics would ask, okay, what do we do if someone, as opposed to being raped one time, and however traumatic that might be and the symptoms that they develop, that might be quite different than being raised in a horrifically abusive situation where you are beaten and maybe even raped as a child over the course of a decade of your life. Doesn't that require a different set of criteria, a different frame to explain and understand those kinds of phenomena? And so there are ways of talking about these kinds of problems outside of PTSD within DSM terms, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that the American Psychiatric Association uses to codify illnesses. But they're waste bin categories. That is, you might say, post-traumatic stress not otherwise specified would be the term. So it's not well developed in a way to capture these things systematically.
when you talk about historical cultural trauma with colleagues, Native colleagues in particular, and you question some of the theories along the way, how are you received?
Well, I've started to do this maybe within the past year and a half, so there hasn't been tons of opportunity yet. But the venues where I have spoken, it's clear that most of the Native folks that I've talked to so far, who are themselves in human services settings largely, are pretty wedded to this idea. And I don't think I have much chance of really changing their minds. On the other hand, I think I do give them some things to think about. And I think that there might be broader audiences that I've yet to reach who might be more willing to rethink the acceptance of this notion.
This next question, last one. When it comes to poverty, substance abuse within Native America, is the patient willing to get better?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to poverty and substance abuse, which are, of course, linked, it's interesting that they would be classed together in reference to a patient, which is often how it's done in human service settings. But, of course, to be a victim of poverty is not to be a patient, although we often link those things because we think about a person who's impoverished as needing to do something themselves, generate inner resources, find some kind of way to transform their own personality or qualities to be able to overcome this. When in fact, poverty, of course, is due often to structural forces in society, which probably are better amenable to intervention at that level. The best study I've ever seen on this involves a county in rural Appalachia where there were Indian kids and white kids, and the study was following both kinds of kids who were growing up, often, some poor, some lower middle class, working class. And they were tracking the mental health outcomes of these kids over the course of several years. This is by Jane Costello and colleagues. And what they found is accidentally in the middle of the study, the Cherokee Nation the Cherokee tribe in that part of the country got a casino going and therefore was generating some income which it was able to spread throughout its members. And the result of that income dispersal, captured by this study because it was a natural experiment, it wasn't planned or predicted to do this way, is the mental health outcomes got a lot better in these Cherokee kids. Now, of course, the authors of the study weren't set out to explore exactly how that would work, but the best guess they offer is that it provided necessary resources so parents could be more at home to supervise their kids and interact with their kids instead of working 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and that's what led to dramatically reduced mental health outcomes in these Indian kids that, of course, weren't available to the white kids in quite the same way. So that's an example of the kind of study that we don't see or hear about very often, because even thinking about mental health problems forces us to focus on the individual and on intrapersonal or intra-individual factors or causes or consequences instead of contextualizing these things within broader social structures.
Very interesting. Dr. Joseph Gahn, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychology and the Program in American Culture at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Thank you so much for coming in today.
I've enjoyed it.